He thought the badge made him untouchable, until the night it stopped meaning anything at all. The highway stretched empty for miles, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through the quiet dark as red and blue lights suddenly burst to life behind a sleek black sedan cruising just under 70 miles per hour, the glow reflecting off the polished surface like a warning no one could ignore. Danielle Brooks glanced at the rearview mirror, her expression unchanged, calm, measured. As she slowly eased her foot off the gas and guided the car to the shoulder, gravel crunching softly beneath the tires, the engine humming low like it too sensed the tension rising in the air, Officer Ryan Cole stepped out of his cruiser with the kind of confidence that didn't come from training but from assumption, his posture rigid, his gaze already locked in judgment before a single word was spoken. The night air carried the faint scent of heated pavement and something heavier, something unspoken, as he approached her window. Flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating her face in sharp contrast. "License and registration," he said, his tone clipped, rehearsed, but edged with something colder. Danielle reached slowly, deliberately, her movements controlled, her breathing steady, as if she had been here before, not this exact road, not this exact moment, but this feeling, this weight pressing down simply because she existed in the wrong place in the wrong eyes. Ryan tilted his head slightly, watching her with a smirk that barely hid the assumption behind it. "You in a hurry? Tonight?" he added, the question less about speed and more about control. Danielle met his gaze, not confrontational, not submissive, just present. "Just heading home," she replied softly, her voice even, unshaken, the kind of calm that didn't invite conflict but didn't retreat from it either. For a brief second, something flickered across his expression, something uncertain, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by the authority he believed was absolute. He stepped back, scanning the car. The interior, her hands as if searching for something to justify what he already decided, the distant hum of another engine passed far off. But out here, on this stretch of road, it felt like they were alone, isolated in a moment that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. Danielle's phone rested silently beside her, the screen dark, but inside, something had already shifted, something unseen, something set in motion long before those lights ever flashed. Ryan returned to the window, his voice firmer now, louder, filling the silence like it belonged to him. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, and for the first time, the air changed, not louder, not more chaotic, but heavier, like the seconds themselves were slowing down. Danielle paused, just for a fraction of a moment, then opened the door and stepped out, her heels touching the gravel with quiet precision. She stood there under the pulsing lights, shadows moving across her face, her eyes steady, watching him, not with fear, not with anger, but with something deeper. Something he didn't recognize, not yet. And as the wind brushed lightly across the empty road, carrying nothing but silence, she spoke, her voice low, almost lost in the night. "You're making a mistake." And Ryan let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if he had heard it all before, as if this was just another routine stop, another story that would end the same way. But somewhere in the distance, barely noticeable, a second set of headlights appeared, growing slowly brighter, cutting through the darkness like a truth that was already on its way. Ryan Cole watched her step out onto the gravel shoulder, the flashing lights painting everything in restless red and blue, his hand resting near his belt not out of necessity but habit, a silent reinforcement of the authority he believed filled the space between them. Danielle Brooks stood still beside her car, the cool night air brushing against her skin, her posture straight, composed, as if the moment unfolding was not new to her. Not unfamiliar, just another variation of something she had learned to navigate long before tonight. Ryan circled the vehicle slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the windows, the tires, the interior, searching, always searching, not for evidence but for confirmation of a story he had already written in his mind. "You mind telling me why you slowed down back there?" he asked, his tone sharper now, less patient, as though her calmness unsettled him in ways he could not quite explain. Danielle turned her head slightly, following his movement without shifting her feet. "I did not think I was speeding," she replied, her voice steady, measured, each word placed carefully, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. Ryan stopped near the rear of the car, the beam of his Flashlight lowering as he studied her again, really studied her this time, the stillness, the lack of fear, the absence of the reactions he was used to, and for a brief moment, something flickered again in his chest, a hesitation he quickly buried beneath a tightening jaw. "Step over here," he said, gesturing toward the front of his cruiser, his voice firmer, louder, as if volume alone could restore the balance he felt slipping. Danielle walked forward without protest, her heels pressing softly into the gravel, each step unhurried, controlled, as the headlights from his cruiser cast long shadows behind her, stretching across the empty road like silent witnesses. The distant glow of approaching headlights grew brighter, though still far enough to be dismissed by anyone not paying attention, but Danielle noticed, not with her eyes, but with a quiet awareness that seemed to settle deeper into her expression. Ryan leaned slightly against the hood of his car, crossing his arms, his stance casual but calculated. "You from around here?" he asked, though the question carried less curiosity and more implication. Danielle met his gaze again, her eyes steady, unwavering. "Does it matter?" she answered softly, not as a challenge, but as a truth that lingered in the air between them. The question seemed to irritate him, his lips tightening as he straightened, pushing off the hood. "It matters when I am trying to figure out what you are doing out here," he replied, his words clipped, each syllable edged with control. Danielle let a small pause settle, just enough to be felt, before she spoke again. "Driving home," she said, the same answer, the same calm, and this time it landed differently, not as compliance, but as something unmovable, something he could not easily push past. The radio on his shoulder crackled faintly, a burst of static breaking the rhythm of the moment. Ryan reached up instinctively, adjusting it, his focus shifting for just a second, just long enough for the headlights in the distance to draw closer, brighter now, no longer distant, no longer ignorable. The low hum of engines approaching cut through the quiet, subtle but undeniable. Danielle's gaze flicked briefly toward the road behind him, then back to him, her expression unchanged, but there was something else now, something beneath the surface, something waiting. Ryan followed her glance, his brow tightening as he turned slightly, noticing the lights for the first time, confusion threading into his posture as the vehicles approached faster than expected, their beams steady, controlled, not like passing traffic, but like something with purpose. Something deliberate, and for the first time since the stop began, the certainty that had filled his voice, his stance, his every movement, began to shift, just slightly, just enough to create a crack in the authority he thought he held, and Danielle stood there in the center of it all, silent, steady, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment all along. The sound reached him before the realization did, a low synchronized hum that did not belong to random traffic, not at this hour, not on this empty stretch of road. Ryan Cole straightened instinctively, his eyes narrowing as the approaching vehicles closed the distance with steady precision, their headlights bright but controlled, not swerving, not slowing in uncertainty, but advancing with intent. Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if the shift in the atmosphere only confirmed something she had already known. The first vehicle pulled to a smooth stop a few yards behind the cruiser, then another, and another, dark silhouettes against the highway, engines idling in quiet authority. Ryan's hand moved to his radio again, fingers tightening slightly as he pressed the button, his voice lower now, edged with something less certain. "Dispatch, I have multiple vehicles approaching my location, requesting identification." Static answered him first, a brief crackle that seemed louder than it should have been. Then a voice came through, not rushed, not alarmed, but controlled, measured. "Unit 14, stand by." The words hung in the air, incomplete, and that was when the doors of the black SUVs opened almost in unison, figures stepping out with deliberate calm, dressed in dark suits, their movements coordinated without needing direction, the kind of presence that did not demand attention yet commanded it completely. Ryan lowered the radio slightly, his jaw tightening as his eyes moved from one figure to the next, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, trying to place it within the framework of authority he understood. Danielle finally shifted her weight, just slightly, her gaze moving past him toward the approaching agents, then back to him, and in that moment, there was no tension in her expression, no urgency, only a quiet certainty that settled deeper than words. One of the agents stepped forward, his posture straight, his voice clear as he addressed Ryan directly. "Officer Cole," he said, not asking, not confirming, but stating it as fact. Ryan's shoulders stiffened, the familiarity of his name in a stranger's voice sending a ripple through his composure. "Who are you?" Ryan asked, his tone attempting firmness but losing its edge at the end. The agent did not answer. Immediately, instead, he reached into his jacket and presented a badge, holding it steady under the flashing lights, the metallic surface catching a different kind of authority, one that did not rely on volume or posture. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said evenly, each word deliberate. Ryan's eyes flicked from the badge to Danielle, then back again, the pieces beginning to shift, not fully formed, not fully understood, but enough to unsettle the ground beneath his certainty. "What is this about?" Ryan pressed, though the question sounded thinner now, less anchored than before. The agent's gaze did not waver as he replied. "This stop involves an active federal operation." The sentence landed with quiet weight, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no room for interpretation. Ryan's grip on the radio loosened slightly, his breath catching for just a fraction of a second as his mind tried to reconcile the situation, the assumptions he had made, the authority he had asserted, all pressing against a reality he had not considered. Danielle took a single step forward, then closing the space just enough for her voice to reach him without effort. "I told you," she said softly, her tone unchanged, not vindictive, not raised, but certain, and for the first time since the lights had appeared behind her car, Ryan Cole did not have a response ready, because in that moment, the power he thought he held was no longer his to define, and the night, which had once felt empty and controlled, now belonged to something far beyond him. The silence that followed did not feel empty, it felt controlled, like every sound on that highway had suddenly been measured and placed exactly where it belonged. Ryan Cole stood still, the weight of the moment settling in ways he could not immediately process, his eyes moving between the badge, the agents, and Danielle Brooks, trying to anchor himself to something familiar, something that still made sense, but nothing did, not anymore. The flashing lights from his cruiser no longer felt dominant, they flickered now like background noise against the steady white beams of the federal vehicles, a different kind of presence, quieter but absolute. The lead agent took one step closer, his voice calm, unwavering. "Officer, we are going to need you to step back from the vehicle and release control of this stop." There was no aggression in his tone, no raised voice, just instruction delivered with certainty, the kind that did not expect resistance. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry, his hand instinctively brushing against his belt before dropping again, the gesture unfinished, uncertain. "I was conducting a routine stop," he said, the words sounding thinner the moment they left his mouth, as if even he could hear the shift in their meaning. The agent nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without validating it. "Understood," he replied. "But this individual is under federal protection during an active operation." The phrase hung in the air, deliberate, final. Ryan's gaze snapped back to Danielle, really seeing her now, not just as a driver, not just as a presence he had already categorized, but as something else entirely, something he had overlooked from the very beginning. Danielle met his eyes without hesitation, her expression unchanged, composed, but there was a clarity there now, a quiet authority that no longer needed to stay hidden, the kind that did not demand recognition because it already existed beyond his approval. "You can remove the restraints," the agent added, his voice steady, not urgent, but firm enough that it left no room for delay. Ryan hesitated, just for a second, a brief flicker of resistance born not from defiance but from disbelief, the kind that comes when reality shifts too quickly for the mind to follow. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, his movements no longer sharp, no longer driven by certainty, but careful, measured, as if every action now carried weight he had not considered before. The metallic click that followed was quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of engines and the distant whisper of wind across the highway. Danielle lowered her hands calmly, not rubbing her wrists, not reacting, just letting them fall naturally at her sides. As if nothing about her composure had changed from the beginning to now, Ryan stepped back immediately, putting Space between them, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, searching for footing that was no longer there. The agent turned slightly toward Danielle, his tone shifting just enough to reflect acknowledgement. "Ma'am," he said, a simple word, but one that carried respect, recognition, something entirely different from what had filled the air minutes before. Danielle gave a small nod, nothing exaggerated, nothing dramatic, just an acceptance of what had already been set in motion long before this stop ever happened. The other agents remained positioned around the scene, not crowding, not escalating, just present, their silence reinforcing everything that had already been said without words. Ryan glanced down briefly, then back up, his mind catching up piece by piece, the assumptions, the tone, the decisions, all replaying in a sequence he could no longer ignore, and for the first time that night, the question formed not in his voice, but in his thoughts, quiet and heavy. How had he missed it? Danielle turned slightly toward her car, then paused, looking back at him one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling, understanding, and in that look, there was no need for explanation, because the answer had already been there from the very start, he just had not been willing to see it. Ryan Cole did not move right away, even after stepping back, even after the restraints were removed. He stood there as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to throw off everything he thought was stable. The flashing lights from his cruiser continued their rhythm, but they no longer felt like control. They felt distant, almost irrelevant. Danielle Brooks turned fully toward her vehicle, her movements unhurried, composed, as if this moment was simply another step in a sequence she had already walked through many times before. One of the agents moved closer to her, speaking in a low voice that did not carry beyond a few feet, but the tone was clear, respectful, coordinated. Ryan caught fragments, words like clearance, timing, perimeter, none of them directed at him, none of them needing his involvement, and that realization settled deeper than anything else. He was no longer part of the center of this moment, he was standing on the outside of something far larger than he had understood just minutes ago. His radio crackled again, louder this time, his supervisor's voice cutting through the static. "Unit 14, confirm status." The question sounded routine, but now it carried a weight Ryan had never noticed before. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the radio, his eyes flicking once more toward Danielle and the agents before finally responding. "Scene is secure," he said, but even as he spoke, the words felt misplaced, as if they no longer belonged to him. The supervisor's voice returned almost immediately, sharper now, more focused. "We have been notified of federal presence at your location. Stand down and await further instruction." The confirmation landed with quiet finality, removing any remaining doubt, any lingering sense of control he might have held on to. Ryan lowered the radio slowly, his shoulders no longer squared, his stance no longer anchored in certainty, just still, just present. Danielle opened the driver's side door and paused, her hand resting lightly on the frame. She looked back once more, not at the agents, not at the vehicles, but at him. And there was something in that moment that stretched beyond the situation itself, something that reached into all the moments before this one, the assumptions, the tone, the way the stop had begun long before the lights ever flashed. "You should be careful," she said quietly, her voice steady, not a warning, not a threat, but something more grounded, more deliberate. Ryan met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no response forming behind his eyes, no quick explanation, no instinctive defense, just silence, because whatever he might have said would not have changed what had already been revealed. Danielle gave a small nod, then slid into her seat, closing the door with a soft, controlled motion. The engine remained running, the low hum blending into the steady presence of the vehicles around her. The lead agent stepped slightly closer to Ryan, his voice calm, professional. "There will be a report filed regarding this interaction," he said, not accusatory, not aggressive, just factual. Ryan nodded once, a short, restrained motion, acknowledging without fully understanding what that would mean. The agent held his gaze for a brief second longer, then turned away, rejoining the others as they moved with quiet efficiency. One by one the agents returned to their vehicles, doors closing with muted precision, engines shifting, headlights adjusting. And just like that, the presence that had filled the highway began to withdraw. Not hurried, not chaotic, but controlled, deliberate. Danielle's car remained still for a moment longer, then slowly, smoothly it pulled back onto the road, merging into the darkness ahead without hesitation. Without looking back again, Ryan stood alone beside his cruiser as the last of the federal vehicles disappeared into the distance, the night returning to its original stillness. But it did not feel the same, not anymore. The silence carried something heavier now, something that lingered, something that did not leave when the lights faded, and as Ryan finally turned toward his car, reaching for the door, there was one thought that stayed with him, quiet but impossible to ignore. The moment had never been his to control, not from the very beginning. The drive back felt longer than it should have, even though the road had not changed. The same miles stretched ahead, the same dim highway lights passing in steady intervals. But inside the cruiser, something had shifted in a way Ryan Cole could not ignore. The silence was no longer routine, it pressed in on him, filling the space where confidence used to sit without question. His hands rested on the steering wheel, firm but not tight. His eyes forward but unfocused, replaying every second of the stop, every word, every tone, every assumption that had come so easily before. The dashboard clock ticked past midnight, the faint glow casting a dull reflection across his face, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel in control of the narrative he had built around himself. The radio remained quiet, no new calls, no distractions, just the low hum of the engine and the distant sound of tires against asphalt. And in that stillness, the moment returned again, not as a blur, but as something sharp, clear, undeniable. The way she had looked at him, not afraid, not reactive, just certain, as if she had known something he did not, as if she had been waiting for the moment when the truth would reveal itself without effort. Ryan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he shifted slightly in his seat, trying to shake the feeling, trying to return to something familiar, but it did not come. Because the certainty he once relied on had cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to let something else in. Something uncomfortable, something real. The patrol station appeared ahead, its lights steady and unchanged, a place that had always felt like structure, like order, like definition. But tonight, as he pulled into the lot, it felt different, not because the building had changed, but because he had. He parked the cruiser and sat there for a moment longer, the engine still running, the faint vibration beneath him grounding him in the present, but his thoughts remained behind. Back on that stretch of road. Back in that moment where everything had shifted. He turned the key and the engine went quiet, the sudden stillness amplifying the weight he carried with him. Stepping out of the vehicle, the cool night air met him again, familiar but sharper now. The sound of his footsteps against the pavement echoed slightly as he walked toward the entrance, each step steady but heavier than usual. Inside, the station moved as it always did, phones ringing, officers talking, paperwork being shuffled, routine continuing without pause. But Ryan felt separate from it, like he was moving through something that no longer aligned with what he thought it was. A few colleagues glanced his way, offering nods, casual acknowledgement, nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and yet, everything felt different beneath the surface. He made his way toward his desk, setting down his keys with a quiet clink, his eyes lingering on them for a second longer than necessary. The small metal pieces representing something he had never questioned before, something he had always believed defined his role, his authority, his place. He sat down slowly, the chair creaking softly beneath him, and for a moment, he just sat there, hands resting on the desk, staring at nothing in particular, until the memory surfaced again, her voice, calm, steady. "You should be careful." Not loud, not threatening, just certain. And now, sitting in the familiar space of the station, those words carried more weight than they had before, not because of what they implied about her, but because of what they revealed about him. Ryan leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as he looked around the room, the same room that had always felt clear, defined, structured, but tonight, it felt different, like there were things beneath the surface he had never fully seen, never fully questioned, and for the first time, that realization did not feel distant, it felt immediate, unavoidable, because the moment on that highway had not ended when the lights disappeared. It had followed him here, settling quietly into everything he thought he understood, And as the noise of the station carried on around him, unchanged, Ryan Cole sat in the middle of it, realizing that something fundamental had shifted, and there was no simple way to return to the version of himself that had stepped out onto that road just hours before. The station lights hummed softly above him, a constant low buzz that had always faded into the background, but tonight it felt louder, sharper, like everything around him had been turned up just enough to make it impossible to ignore. Ryan Cole sat at his desk, staring at the incident report screen that remained blank, the cursor blinking steadily as if waiting for a version of events he could no longer easily construct. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then pulled back, the words refusing to come the way they usually did, clean, confident, unquestioned, because this time, every detail felt different, every choice heavier, every assumption harder to justify. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the desk, hands clasped together as he exhaled slowly, the memory replaying again, not just the moment when the agents arrived, but everything before that, the tone of his voice, the way he approached her car, the way he had already decided who she was before she ever spoke, the certainty that had guided him without hesitation, and now, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, that certainty felt fragile, incomplete. The door to the supervisor's office opened with a soft click, drawing his attention as Lieutenant Harris stepped out, his expression neutral but focused, his eyes scanning the room briefly before landing on Ryan. There was no raised voice, no immediate confrontation. Just a simple gesture, a slight tilt of the head toward the office. "Cole, step in for a minute." The words were calm, but they carried weight, the kind that did not need emphasis. Ryan stood slowly, pushing his chair back with a quiet scrape against the floor, every movement measured, controlled, as if he were already aware that whatever came next would not be routine. The walk to the office felt shorter than usual, but heavier, each step closing a distance he could not avoid. He entered and the door closed behind him, muting the noise of the station, leaving only the steady hum of the overhead light, and the faint sound of papers shifting on the desk. Lieutenant Harris did not sit right away. Instead, he remained standing for a moment, looking at Ryan with a gaze that was not angry, not even disappointed, but assessing, thoughtful, as if weighing something beyond the immediate situation. "I just got off the phone with Federal," he said finally, his voice even, controlled. Ryan nodded once, his posture straight but no longer rigid. "Yes, sir," he replied, the response automatic but quieter than usual. Harris walked around the desk slowly, placing a file down with deliberate care before taking a seat, his hands resting on the surface, fingers lightly interlocked. "They have already submitted a preliminary report," he continued, his eyes steady on Ryan, "and they are requesting a full review of the stop." The words were not unexpected, but hearing them stated so plainly made something tighten in Ryan's chest, not fear exactly, but the recognition of consequence, real and unavoidable. He shifted slightly, his hands moving behind his back as he stood there, listening, processing. "Walk me through what happened," Harris said, not as a demand, but as an invitation, one that left no room for shortcuts. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, then paused, just for a moment, because for the first time, explaining what happened meant more than listing actions. It meant confronting the decisions behind them, the assumptions he had carried without question, the tone he had chosen without thought. He took a breath, steadying himself, and began, his voice measured, slower than usual, each word placed carefully, as if he were hearing it for the first time himself. And as he spoke, the room remained quiet, no interruptions, no immediate reactions, just the steady presence of someone listening, not just to what happened, but to how it happened. And somewhere in the middle of that explanation, Ryan realized that this was not just about a single stop on an empty highway. It was about everything that led up to it, everything he had believed without examining, everything he had carried without questioning. And for the first time, that realization did not feel distant, it felt immediate, undeniable. And as the last of his words settled into the silence of the room, he understood that whatever came next would not simply be about procedure, it would be about something deeper, something that could not be ignored any longer. Ryan Cole's voice faded as he finished recounting the stop, the last word settling into the quiet space between him and Lieutenant Harris like something heavier than sound. The room remained still for a moment, the kind of silence that was not empty but deliberate. Harris did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, thoughtful, as if he was not just hearing the report but measuring what lay beneath it, the tone, the choices. The pauses that spoke louder than the words themselves. Ryan stood there, shoulders squared but no longer rigid, waiting, not for judgment exactly, but for something that would define what this moment meant. Harris finally leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the desk before going still. "You understand why this is not routine," he said, his voice calm, controlled, not accusatory, but clear. Ryan nodded once, slower this time, the acknowledgement carrying more weight than before. "Yes, sir," he replied, but even as he said it, he knew that understanding it now was not the same as seeing it then. Harris studied him for a second longer, then reached for the file on his desk, opening it with a quiet motion, the pages inside crisp, organized, precise, the kind of documentation that did not leave room for interpretation. "Federal reports are very specific," Harris continued, his eyes moving briefly across the page before returning to Ryan. "They do not focus on what you intended, they focus on what you did." The distinction landed clearly, leaving no space to shift. Responsibility or soften the edges. Ryan felt it settle in, not as a shock, but as confirmation of something he had already begun to realize. Harris closed the file slowly, resting his hand on top of it. "There is going to be an internal review," he said, the words steady, final. "And until that process is complete, you will be placed on administrative duty." Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. Not in resistance, but in acceptance, the kind that comes when the outcome no longer surprises you. He nodded again. "Understood," he said quietly. Harris did not look away, his gaze holding steady, not harsh, not cold, but firm in a way that carried expectation. "This is not just about procedure," he added, his tone lowering just enough to shift the weight of the conversation. "It is about judgment." The word lingered, heavier than the rest, because it pointed to something deeper than policy, something that could not be corrected with paperwork alone. Ryan felt the truth of it settle in, not as something new, but as something he had avoided naming until now. Harris leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged but his voice carrying a subtle shift. "Take the time you need to think about that," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a directive that extended beyond the walls of the office. Ryan stood there for a moment longer, then gave a final nod before turning toward the door, his hand pausing briefly on the handle as if marking the transition between what had been and what would follow. When he stepped back into the main area of the station, the noise returned immediately, phones ringing, conversations overlapping, the rhythm of routine continuing without interruption, but it no longer felt the same, not because anything around him had changed, but because he had. The desk he had sat at earlier was still there, the keys still resting where he had left them, but they no longer held the same meaning. He walked past them without stopping, his steps slower now, more deliberate, as if each one carried a weight he had not noticed before. A few officers glanced up again, offering the same casual nods, unaware of the shift that had taken place, unaware of the moment that had altered something fundamental beneath the surface. Ryan moved toward the back hallway, away from the center of the station, toward a quieter space where the noise faded into a distant hum, and as he stood there, alone for the first time since returning, the memory came back again, not just the lights, not just the voices, but the look in her eyes, steady, certain, unchanged from beginning to end, and in that memory, there was something he could no longer dismiss, something that did not fade with time or distance, because it was not just about what happened on that road, it was about what had been revealed in him. Something that could not be undone, only faced, and as the quiet settled around him, Ryan Cole realized that the real weight of that night was not in the report, not in the review, but in the understanding that followed him into every moment after. The hallway felt narrower than it had just minutes before, not because the walls had moved but because the weight of everything Ryan Cole carried with him made the space feel tighter, more defined, the low hum of the station fading behind him as he leaned lightly against the cool surface of the wall, his arms crossing slowly, not out of defense but out of habit, a gesture he had used countless times before without thinking. But now even that felt different, more deliberate, more noticeable. The events of the night replayed again, not in fragments but in sequence, clearer with each pass, the moment the lights flashed, the way he approached the car, the tone he chose before he even saw her face, and then the shift, the arrival, the realization that everything he assumed had been wrong, not partially, not slightly, but completely. He exhaled quietly, his gaze dropping to the floor for a brief second before lifting again, as if searching for something stable to hold on to, but there was nothing outside of himself that could anchor this, because the question was no longer about what happened, it was about why it happened the way it did. Footsteps echoed faintly from the far end of the hallway, another officer passing by without slowing, offering a brief nod that Ryan returned automatically, the routine still moving around him, unchanged, untouched by what had unfolded, and that contrast only made it more real, because the world had not stopped, the system had not paused, only he had, caught in a moment that refused to settle into something simple. His mind drifted back again, but this time not just to the highway, not just to Danielle Brooks, but to other stops, other moments that had felt routine at the time. Quick decisions made without hesitation, conclusions drawn before conversations even began. Patterns he had never questioned because they had always seemed to work, always seemed to align with what he believed his role required, and now those moments felt different when seen through the lens of this one, not identical, but connected, threads in something larger he had never fully examined. The sound of a door opening somewhere behind him broke the rhythm of his thoughts, followed by quiet voices, then footsteps again. The station continuing its steady pace, Ryan pushed himself off the wall slowly, straightening his posture, not with the same rigid confidence as before, but with a quieter awareness, something more grounded, more cautious. He walked toward the small break room at the end of the hall, the overhead lights dimmer there, the air slightly cooler, the hum of a vending machine filling the silence. He stepped inside and paused, his reflection catching briefly in the darkened glass of the window, and for a moment he looked at himself not as an officer, not as a role defined by badge or uniform, but as something simpler, something more human, and in that reflection, there was no immediate answer, no clear resolution, just the recognition that the certainty he once carried so easily was no longer intact. He rested his hands on the edge of the counter, fingers spread slightly, grounding himself in the physical space as his thoughts continued to move, not in circles, but forward. Slowly, deliberately, towards something he had not fully reached yet. The memory of her voice returned again, steady, quiet, certain, not loud enough to dominate the moment but strong enough to remain long after it passed, and now, standing in the stillness of that small room, he understood something he had not before, that the moment on that highway had not been about control or authority or even procedure, it had been about perception, about the way he saw and the way he chose not to see, and that realization did not come with relief. It came with responsibility, the kind that does not fade when the shift ends or the report is filed, but stays, shaping what comes next, shaping the choices that follow. And as Ryan Cole stood there, alone with that understanding, he knew that whatever path he took from this point forward would not be measured by the certainty he once relied on, but by something far more difficult to navigate, something that required him to look again, to question again, to see again, even when it would have been easier not to. The vending machine hummed steadily in the corner, a quiet mechanical rhythm that seemed to mark time in a way Ryan Cole could not ignore, each second stretching just long enough for his thoughts to settle deeper, heavier, more defined. He straightened slowly, pushing himself away from the counter, his reflection fading as he turned toward the door, and for a brief moment he paused, not because he did not know where to go, but because he understood that stepping back into the station meant stepping forward into something he could not avoid, something already in motion. The hallway greeted him with the same muted noise as before, footsteps, distant voices, the soft echo of routine continuing without interruption, but now every sound felt sharper, more intentional, as if the world around him had not changed but his awareness of it had. He walked back toward the main floor, his pace steady but no longer automatic, each step grounded in a kind of focus he had not carried earlier that night. When he reached his desk, the blank report screen still waited, the cursor blinking patiently, unchanged, but the space in front of him felt different now, not empty, but demanding. He pulled the chair back and sat down, his hands resting on the keyboard, fingers hovering once again. But this time the hesitation was not confusion, it was intention. He began to type slowly, each word deliberate, not just recording what happened, but choosing how to present it, aware that this document would not simply describe an event, it would reflect his judgment, his decisions, his perspective, and that realization guided every sentence he formed. The language was precise, stripped of assumption, focused on facts, but even within that structure, he could feel the weight of what had been left unsaid, the tone, the approach, the unspoken elements that had shaped the moment long before it escalated. He paused after a few lines, his eyes scanning what he had written, and for the first time, he questioned not whether it was accurate, but whether it was complete, the difference between those two things settling into his thoughts with quiet clarity. The chair across from him shifted slightly as another officer sat down nearby, glancing over with a casual expression. "Long night," the officer said, the words simple, routine. Ryan gave a short nod. "Yeah," he replied, his voice even, but there was something beneath it now, something that did not invite further conversation. The officer nodded back and turned away, returning to his own work without pressing, the moment passing as quickly as it came. But Ryan remained focused on the screen, the report in front of him no longer just a task to complete, but a process he could not rush through. He continued typing, the rhythm slower than usual, more measured, each sentence carrying the quiet awareness that this was not just about documenting a stop, it was about acknowledging the reality of it, the choices that had led to it, the impact it carried beyond the moment itself. Time moved forward without announcement, the station clock ticking steadily above, the noise around him rising and falling in waves, but he remained there, anchored to the task, until finally, after what felt longer than it should have, he leaned back slightly, his hands resting in his lap as he looked at the completed report, the cursor no longer blinking at an empty space, but resting at the end of something that felt both finished and unfinished at the same time. He knew this would not be the final version, not the last word, but it was a beginning, a step into something more honest than what he might have written before. He reached for the mouse, hesitating just for a fraction of a second before submitting the report, the click quiet, almost insignificant, but the action carried weight, because once it was sent, it would no longer belong only to him. It would be reviewed, examined, interpreted, and that process was already underway. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting from the screen to the room around him, the same room that had always felt predictable, structured, clear, but now held something more complex beneath the surface, something that required more than routine to navigate. And as he sat there, the memory of that night did not fade, it did not soften, it remained exactly as it had happened, clear, steady, and impossible to ignore, not because of the outcome, but because of what it had revealed. And in that realization, Ryan Cole understood that the next step was not about moving past it, it was about carrying it forward, allowing it to shape what came next, even when that meant facing parts of himself he had never fully questioned before. The confirmation message appeared on the screen with a quiet finality that did not match the weight it carried. The report had been submitted, processed into a system that would now move forward without him needing to push it, without him being able to control what came next. Ryan Cole stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, as if expecting something else to appear, some immediate response, some indication of what would follow, but there was nothing, just the same interface. The same steady glow, the same routine structure that now felt distant from what he had just done. He leaned back slowly, the chair shifting beneath him with a soft creak, his hands resting loosely on the armrests, not tense, not rigid, just still. The noise of the station continued around him, unchanged, conversations overlapping, phones ringing, the steady rhythm of a place that never paused, even when something significant had occurred within it. And that contrast settled into him again, the realization that moments like the one he had experienced did not stop the world, they only changed the person inside them. A shadow crossed the edge of his desk and he looked up to see Lieutenant Harris standing there, not calling him into the office this time, not signaling anything formal, just present, his posture relaxed but his eyes focused. "It is in motion now," Harris said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the surrounding noise. Ryan nodded once, the acknowledgement simple but weighted. "Yes, sir," he replied. Harris studied him for a brief second, then gave a slight nod. Of his own, not approval, not dismissal, but something in between, something that recognized the shift without needing to define it. "Take the rest of the shift off," he added, his tone even. "Administrative duty starts tomorrow." The words were straightforward, expected, but hearing them stated so plainly made them real in a way that no internal thought could replicate. Ryan stood slowly, pushing the chair back with controlled movement, his gaze steady, not avoiding, not searching, just present. "Understood," he said again, and this time the words carried a different kind of meaning, not just compliance, but acceptance. Harris gave one final look, then turned and walked away, blending back into the flow of the station without drawing attention. Ryan remained standing for a moment, his eyes drifting across the room, taking in the familiar details that now felt slightly altered, the desks, the monitors, the quiet exchanges between officers. All of it continuing as it always had, but no longer fitting as easily into the framework he once relied on. He reached down and picked up his keys, the small metallic weight resting in his palm, familiar but changed, as if the meaning attached to them had shifted along with everything else. He turned and began walking toward the exit, his steps steady, measured, each one carrying him away from the space that had defined so much of his identity, at least until now. The automatic doors slid open with a soft mechanical sound, the cool night air meeting him once again, sharper than before, more noticeable, as if it carried a clarity that had not been there earlier. He stepped outside, the parking lot quiet, the rows of vehicles still, the sky stretching above in dark silence, and for a moment, he simply stood there, not moving, not rushing to leave, just present in the stillness. The memory of the highway returned again, but this time it felt different, not like something replaying, but like something settling, finding its place within him, no longer chaotic, no longer overwhelming, but clear, defined, unavoidable. He walked toward his car, unlocking it with a soft click, the interior light flickering on as he opened the door. And as he sat down behind the wheel, the same position he had been in countless times before, it did not feel the same, not because the car had changed, but because the perspective he carried into it had. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, staring out through the windshield at the quiet lot ahead, and in that moment, there was no immediate plan, no quick resolution. Just the understanding that what had happened would not fade with time, it would remain, shaping what came next, shaping how he saw, how he acted, how he chose to move forward. And as the engine started with a low hum, blending into the silence of the night, Ryan Cole knew that whatever road he took from here would not be the same one he thought he was driving before. The road ahead stretched quiet and open as Ryan Cole pulled out of the station parking lot, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement, the hum of the engine steady beneath him. But his mind was anything but quiet. The city lights blurred slightly in the distance, familiar streets now carrying a different weight. Each intersection, each passing car, each shadow along the roadside felt sharper, more defined. As if he was seeing everything for the first time without the filter he had always relied on. He drove without turning on the radio, without reaching for anything to fill the silence, because the silence itself had become something he needed to hear, something that forced him to stay present with what had happened, with what it meant. The memory of the highway did not replay in fragments anymore. It stood whole, complete, every detail clear, from the moment the lights came on to the moment they faded behind him. And within that memory, one thing remained constant: her composure, her certainty, the way she never once reacted the way he expected, never once fit into the assumptions he had already made. And that realization followed him now, not as a sudden shock, but as something steady, something that did not need to repeat itself to be understood. He slowed at a red light, the glow reflecting off the windshield, casting a soft color across his face. And for a moment, everything stopped, the engine idling, the city paused around him, and in that stillness, he thought about how quickly he had decided, how easily he had assumed, not just tonight, but before, moments he had never revisited because they had never forced him to, and now, sitting at that light, he understood that the absence of consequence had never meant the absence of impact. The light turned green, but he did not move right away, just a second longer than usual. Enough to recognize the shift before pressing the gas and continuing forward. The streets began to empty as he moved farther from the station, the buildings thinning out, the noise fading into the background, until it was just him, the road, and the quiet. He passed a stretch of highway that looked almost identical to the one from earlier, the same wide lanes, the same dark horizon, and for a brief moment, it felt like time folding back on itself, like the same situation could happen again. The same choices could present themselves, and the question settled in, not as a fear, but as something more grounded. What would he do differently? He did not answer it out loud, did not try to force a conclusion, but the awareness was there, the understanding that the next moment like that would not be met with the same certainty he once carried. It would require something else, something slower, something more deliberate. He turned onto a quieter street, the streetlights spaced farther apart, the darkness deeper between them, and as he drove through that shifting pattern of light and shadow, the thought returned, not about what he had lost, but about what had been revealed, something that had always been there beneath the surface, waiting for a moment like this to bring it forward. His grip on the steering wheel loosened slightly, not out of carelessness, but out of a kind of release, the tension that had built over the night settling into something more stable, more real. He pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, the sudden quiet filling the space around him, the faint ticking of the cooling engine the only sound left. He sat there for a moment, hands resting in his lap, eyes forward, not rushing to move, not trying to escape the stillness, because for the first time, the stillness did not feel empty, it felt necessary, like a space where something new could begin to take shape. And as Ryan Cole stepped out of the car and closed the door behind him, the night air cool against his skin, there was no clear resolution waiting for him, no simple answer to what had happened, only the understanding that this was not the end of something, but the beginning of a different way of seeing. One that would follow him into every road he drove from this point on. Morning came quietly, the kind of light that did not rush but settled slowly across the edges of everything, filling the space with a calm that felt unfamiliar after the weight of the night before. Ryan Cole stood by the window of his home, a cup of coffee untouched in his hand, his gaze fixed on the street outside, watching as the world moved forward without hesitation, cars passing, neighbors stepping out for their routines. Nothing visibly changed, and yet for him, everything felt different. Beneath the surface, the memory of the highway had not faded with sleep, it had stayed clear and steady, not as something that demanded attention, but as something that refused to be ignored. He took a slow breath, the warmth of the cup grounding him in the present, but his thoughts remained layered, reflecting not just on what had happened, but on what it meant. The uniform he had worn for years now hung over the back of a chair nearby. Still, familiar, unchanged, but the meaning attached to it no longer felt automatic, no longer unquestioned. He walked toward it slowly, his hand brushing lightly against the fabric, feeling the weight of it in a way he had not before, not heavier physically, but different in significance, something that required more than presence to carry, something that demanded awareness, intention, accountability. He stepped back, leaving it where it was, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition that the next time he wore it, it would not be the same as before. The silence in the room was steady, not empty, but reflective, and in that stillness, one thought became clear. The night had not taken something from him, it had shown him something. Something that had always been there but had never been fully seen. He set the coffee down and moved toward the door, the decision simple, not dramatic, just a step forward. Outside, the air was cool, the sunlight sharper now, casting defined shadows along the pavement. He paused for a moment, looking down the street, then up again, the world ahead open, unchanged in appearance, but no longer something he could move through without thought. Without question, he understood now that authority was not something given by a badge alone, it was something shaped by every decision, every interaction, every moment where perception could either limit or expand what was true, and that understanding did not come with ease, it came with responsibility, the kind that stayed long after the moment had passed. He walked to his car, unlocking it, the familiar click echoing slightly in the morning quiet, and as he sat behind the wheel. The same position he had occupied countless times before, he paused. Not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his eyes forward, and for the first time, there was no rush to move, no automatic transition into routine, just a quiet acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place. He started the engine, the low hum rising beneath him, and pulled out onto the street, the road stretching ahead, simple, open, unchanged, but as he drove forward, the meaning of that road was no longer what it had been, because this time, he was not just following it, he was seeing it, every detail, every possibility, every choice, and in that awareness, something settled, not a resolution, not an ending, but a beginning, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but remain steady, guiding what comes next, because the truth was never hidden, it was only overlooked, and now that he had seen it, there was no returning to the version of himself who had not, and as the morning light stretched across the road ahead, one thought remained, quiet but certain. He once believed he was the law, but now he understood that the law was something far greater than him. Something that required more than authority to carry, something that required truth.